Global Conservation Corps presents the Rhino Man Podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of Rhino Man the Movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. Hey everyone, before I introduce the show, I just want to thank you all for listening to this podcast, sharing the episodes. We're now up to episode 30 and we're going strong. By 2023, we'll have more ways for you to support. But for now, the most impactful action you can take is to subscribe to or follow us on your favorite podcast platform and then rate us and leave us a review. You don't know how much this means and the effects it can have in spreading the word. The platforms see this, it shows it to other people and allows us to continue to grow. Another thing you could do is tell everyone you know about the podcast. Share it on social media, talk to your friends about it, just help us get out there. Because we really want this podcast to continue to grow. We want to be able to support these amazing conservation efforts around the world. But in order to justify the endless hours it takes to bring it to life, we really need your help. So thank you again and enjoy the show. In this episode, I'm talking with Charlie Mayhew, MBE. Charlie is the co-founder and CEO of Tusk Trust. Their mission is to amplify the impact of progressive conservation initiatives across Africa. Charlie was educated at Wellington College, worked as a Lloyd's marine insurance broker while moonlighting as a DJ, is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and was awarded an MBE, Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, by Her Majesty The Queen. In 1990, he co-founded the charity Tusk Trust, and under his stewardship, it has grown into a highly reputable and efficient UK conservation charity. In this conversation, we dive into Charlie's path into conservation, including a 1985 expedition he led across Africa, and the film he co-produced, which led to the foundations of Tusk. We take a winding path through all the various organizations Trust supports across Africa, dig into their ethos, and talk about the power of ambassadors, including Tusk's royal patron, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. And of course, we explore the importance of rangers, and the amazing support for them through Tusk Wildlife Ranger Challenge and the Tusk Awards. Charlie has a captivating life story, and with over £100 million raised since its inception, Tusk has had and continues to have massive impact on conservation and community development programs. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Charlie. All right, welcome to the show, Charlie. So great to have you. Yeah, really looking forward to diving into your story and the work you're doing at Tusk.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be invited.
Yeah, I imagine you're trying to recover a little bit. You guys recently had the Tusk Awards. I think it was the 10th anniversary. It looked like it went really, really well. How are you feeling about it all?
Yeah, no, it was a fantastic event. I have to say it's probably my favorite event of the year when we are able to shine the spotlight on some really remarkable people working across the African continent in the conservation sector. And this year being the 10th anniversary, we sort of went all out and had this very sort of glitzy event at Hampton Court Palace with our patron Prince William, who was awarding the trophies. And it's always a very humbling event when you hear and see the stories that we put up on screen of these amazing people doing incredible work.
Yeah, and I was following it a bit online, and it's just so many amazing people you guys highlight and do a wonderful job of creating visual content and storytelling around it, which I think really engages people around the world as you guys are celebrating these men and women. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, they're very human stories. And of course, and that's what really, I think, helps to captivate the audience and all of the individuals we recognize this year, along with actually, because it was the 10th anniversary, we brought back to London, I think it was, something like 15 of the previous award winners and finalists, the alumni of the Tusk Awards came to London to sort of celebrate that 10th anniversary, but also then the following day, we had the opportunity to host a symposium, a little mini symposium, which again, actually, very luckily, Prince William was able to attend. These symposiums are fantastic opportunity to get our partners on the ground to share ideas and solutions and challenges and explore ways in which they can work together.
Really exciting. And I think, was Richard Bonham a part of that? I met him at Big Life not too long ago, and I think he said he was coming.
Absolutely. So Richard was, if I remember correctly, was our second winner of the Prince William Award back in 2014. The work that he's done with Big Life in the Chulus and Amboseli ecosystem is absolutely fantastic. And so he's been a long-standing partner of Tusk, and we've supported him for many years. But no, he was very much there.
Yeah, great. And we might be able to dig into Big Life a little bit more later on, but why don't we go into, just give everyone a brief overview who you are and what Tusk is, if you can kind of give the 30,000 feet.
Yeah. So for my sins, I set up Tusk in 1990, so some 32 years ago. And that was having myself had the opportunity to travel to Africa after I left school. And like so many people who visit that continent, fell in love with it. And it sort of somehow has this ability to get under your skin and never leaves you. So I became very interested in trying to support conservation in my own little way and set up the charity with a friend of mine. But we never envisaged it getting very big. It was just really meant to be a bit of a hobby. It was our way of putting something back. But one thing led to another, and the organization has grown out of all recognition that period. The charity, although the name is perhaps synonymous with tusked animals, say elephants and rhino, the focus of the charity and the objective of the charity has always been to support the full spectrum of Africa's amazing natural heritage and all species. So we have a portfolio of projects right across the continent in some 20 odd countries, ranging from turtle and marine conservation to gorilla conservation, and of course, including the megafauna like elephant and rhino, and so much of the work that we're doing now is really about trying to preserve these last huge landscapes that are so valuable, not only to Africa but actually to the world, and so the charity has, alongside its focus on wildlife conservation, has recognized that really the future success of conservation is totally dependent on how we relate conservation to the human population, to the people that coexist with wildlife, and sometimes have the challenges of human-wildlife conflict. They lose their livestock to predators, or they have their crops trampled by elephants, or these are the challenges that Africa really faces. In addition to, I think, the issue that many of us are very familiar with, which is illegal wildlife trade and the poaching of particularly species like elephant and rhino over many decades, that has been fueled by the demand for rhino horn and ivory and other products, primarily across the Far East.
Yeah, and I'd love to dive into a lot of the different projects you guys are working on. There's just so much going on. Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling to me how you've managed to work on so many different projects. But before we go there, can we go back to the beginning? And where did you grow up? Was there ever a desire to get into this conservation space, or was that something that grew over time? Just curious, a little bit of the background.
Yeah, I grew up in the south of England, in the county of Sussex, living on a farm. So I always had a sort of rural upbringing, but I had an aunt and uncle who lived in Africa. And so as a child growing up, they used to come back to England every now and then. And I was always struck by, these wonderful stories, from the African bush. So when I had my first opportunity to visit Africa, was just after I left school. I ended up going out to South Africa, nothing to do with wildlife conservation, but just to do a sort of gap year type job. And I ended up as a sort of traveling salesman selling stationery, barrows and pens around the industrial estates of Johannesburg and other towns in South Africa. But at the weekends, I had the opportunity, one, to go and stay with my aunt and uncle in the countryside in Natal, but also to go out to places like the Kruger National Park. And that was really the first moment where I was sort of struck by, this incredible wildlife and natural heritage that Africa, enjoys. So I ended up doing a few more trips out there. And then I was working in the city of London in the insurance world. And I confess I was getting a little bit bored. And all I wanted to do was to travel back to Africa. So I persuaded the company I was working for to allow me and to sponsor me to take an expedition. And I ended up taking a large group of 33 young people aged between 20 and 25 on a blind date, basically. And we traveled across Africa. We drove in a convoy of 8 vehicles from London across France and then down across the Sahara, through Central Africa, the Congo, across to East Africa, and eventually all the way down to Cape Town. And it took 7 months, that expedition. And in order to try and give it some form of justification, we decided that we better do something worthwhile, and we undertook a few projects en route. And one of those projects in particular was to help put up a perimeter fence in a place called Lake Nakuru National Park, where the Kenyan government wanted to reintroduce the rhino. And rhinos were being lost because of poaching at the time. And they needed to put rhino into highly secured sanctuaries, and that required a serious fence being put up. And so we were tasked with putting up a section of that fence. And that was really, I guess, the moment where I became aware of the challenges that conservation was facing and the threats to rhino in particular, but also elephant. And that was really a transformative moment in my life, that I decided I wanted to try and do something about it.
That's quite an expedition. That's not like your little, hey, let's go for a week in Africa. How did you put that together? I mean, that sounds, you don't have to go into too much detail, but it sounds like you basically started your own tourism company at that point.
Well, it was the beauty of being so naive. And my parents had never been to Africa, so they were even more naive about it. So they didn't really realize, I think, what their son was about to embark on. And in those days, there were no mobile phones. This was in the mid-'80s. And so communication across the continent was not easy. In fact, I would only be able to communicate back home via the old telex machine from the embassies that we used to reach when we got to the capital city of whichever country we were in. So it was an amazing experience. It was fantastic. It really was. I'm not sure you could do the itinerary that we did then. Now, I think probably a little bit too dangerous in places, but no, it was a really an incredible trip.
Yeah, I could imagine tons and tons of memories from that experience. So moving on, I know there's a good story about some of the beginnings of Tusk, and as a filmmaker, I'm definitely interested in it. So maybe you can kind of lead us up to that point and how you got there and what happened there.
So having come back from the expedition, during which, by the way, I'd made a sort of fly-on-the-wall documentary for Channel 4 television here. Great friend of mine who's an actor. One evening we were discussing, the issues around the devastating loss and decline in elephants and rhinos across Africa due to poaching. And he said to me, you've just done a documentary. Why don't you go back out there to make a documentary about this crisis? And we thought about it for a bit, and I said, well, I don't know. I think all the big broadcasters would be on the case, and it probably wasn't going to be worthwhile. We'd be beaten by everybody else. But as we were sort of steadily getting a little bit more drunk together, I said, well, hang on a minute, you're an actor, and as a result, you're permanently out of work, and you're always looking for parts. So why don't we instead create a drama, a thriller based on the ivory trade? And that way we can reach a far wider audience than preaching to the converted through documentary. What's even better, you can have one of the lead parts. So we were extraordinarily ignorant and naive about how the film industry worked. But nevertheless, we sort of touted the idea around a few friends. We raised a little bit of money to commission some screenplays. And then we started sort of trying to see whether we could raise, the main funding for the budget. And it was going to cost about $7 million at the time. And we got some way to putting together a serious consortium of investors. But unfortunately, right at the last minute, one of the main investors pulled out due to another project that had run over budget of his. And so we were sort of left slightly stranded. But one of the things I loved about Los Angeles and working there briefly was that how there was such a can-do sort of attitude to life. And so within no time at all, within a couple of days, actually, I'd been introduced to a new film director with a new script that was going to cost half the budget. And, to cut a very long story short, we ended up making this film. And the whole concept was that we wanted to make this film so that the profits could go back into conservation. And so that's why Tusk was actually founded, was to be the charitable vehicle to receive the profits from this film. Mm. But what we hadn't banked on is that, needless to say, a lot of people in Hollywood weren't particularly keen to give up any profits. But secondly, we were, as I say, so naive that I think we probably met every sort of some quite sort of unusual characters in the film industry who saw us coming and took advantage of us. And in the end, we made the film, which was fantastic. It was great, but it didn't make any money. It lost money, like so many movies do. And it wasn't helped by the fact that, unfortunately, Disney came out with a film called A Far Off Place with Reese Witherspoon.
Yeah,
and it was a fairly similar storyline to ours. And so with the marketing and the power and the weight of Disney, we were just blown out of the water. We didn't have a chance. But of course, by this stage, we had the charity in place. And so, I thought, well, we better just start fundraising in a more traditional manner. And so that was really how the charity was born.
Yeah, that's wild. And I love the naivete and, just going for it and trying to figure it out. I feel like, there are people stumble and fall doing those kinds of things, but that's how you figure it out. And like you eventually found your way to how you're doing it now. Not to dwell on it too much, but did you guys go back to Africa to shoot it? Where did you end up shooting the actual project?
Yeah, we did. We shot in Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Botswana.
Do you remember how long the production was?
Oh, we were on the shoot for about 8 weeks, I think it was.
Yeah, that's pretty good length.
No, it was fantastic. It was, there was some of the best days of my life really out there. And we had a lot of fun making it.
Is it still available anywhere?
Somewhere, I guess it is. I don't know. I think it's. The film is called Lost in Africa, and I often joke that that's really what happened to it. It got lost in Africa.
That's funny. The amazing story. And once you guys realized you needed to go back to more traditional routes of fundraising, how did things develop from there? Because this has grown into supporting so many different kinds of projects. What were the early days like? What was your main focus?
So the early focus was, I guess it was more on sort of elephant and rhino, or efforts to try and protect elephant and rhino in particular. And it was the early days. Those days, Richard Leakey had just taken over, famous conservationist Richard Leakey had just taken over running the Kenya Wildlife Service, and we worked alongside him to support him in a very modest way, because we were raising very small sums of money in those days. Because after the film, I sort of went back into business and into the financial services industry and had a small sort of boutique business that I ran. And so the charity sort of ran off the back of that in the early years. So we would do the odd event and raise some money, and then we would allocate it to whichever project we felt. But slowly but surely we grew, and then I took on a member of staff, a director, to help take us to the next stage. And that then just continued and allowed us, as we grew, to slowly build up the portfolio of projects that we were supporting. And I think it's important to emphasize that we never intended to implement projects ourselves. It was never about us trying to sort of put our stamp or impose our ideas. It was very much about trying to, and this has always been the ethos of the charity, it's always been about trying to identify what we feel are the best conservationists and practitioners operating on the ground, who are really delivering impact and having success. And so I often use the analogy that Tusk is really a little bit like a fund manager, that we are looking for the best sort of conservation investments with the best conservation return. And we get behind them, and we invest in them, and it's about investing in people ultimately. And so we have built up this portfolio, a very diverse portfolio now, about 45 projects across 20 countries, that is covering a range of different species and habitats and landscapes.
Yeah, after all these years of doing this, how have you developed your way of choosing projects to work with? I mean, what are some of the key things you're looking for?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the elements that we really do try and prioritize is whether a project has got, or an organization, a grassroots organization, to what extent have they been successful, or will they be successful in engaging the local community in those conservation efforts. We feel very strongly that, as I said earlier, that the long-term success of conservation is reliant on that relationship, the dependency between the human population and its interest in preserving the environment around it. So a very significant proportion of our project partners have a very strong human dimension to them. And we have been really at the forefront of supporting community-led, community-managed conservation programs. This is where, in countries like Kenya, for instance, where something like 60 to 70% of its wildlife lives outside national parks, outside those traditional protected areas. And so, the future of that wildlife, is really in the hands of the people. So what has been really exciting, and one of the things that I think that I'm most proud of with Tusk is that, we've backed for many years now, since the sort of around by 1997, I think was the first one, we have backed the rollout of and the creation of community conservancies. These are conservation areas which are, on community land, whereby we've been able to help these organizations and these communities to derive really tangible benefits from putting in place conservation programs that has brought in nature-based enterprise, ecotourism and such like, that is generating employment and revenue for those communities and allowing them really to view wildlife as their asset and not as a threat, and therefore gives them the incentive to preserve it. And so, that's really been at the heart of our approach to conservation and a significant majority of the projects that we support.
Yeah, that's really great. And I totally agree. I think that's the future of conservation is people need to benefit from these places. And I don't know if maybe you can give a little bit of historical context and what you've seen since the beginning. I mean, is that something that wasn't so much happening back when you started out? And has that been, it seems like it's becoming more and more the case that communities are being involved.
Yes, I absolutely. I think in the early years of Tusk, in the early 90s, partly as a result of the illegal wildlife trade, we have to remember we were losing something like 100,000 elephants a year to poaching at that time. There was what you might call a fortress mentality to conservation. It was all about putting up fences and sort of understandably sort of locking the animals in and locking the people out. But what we've seen over the last 30 years has been a very sort of significant movement to the recognition of the value of this community-led type initiative, and I find that really exciting. I mean, in the first two community conservancies that we sponsored and got behind in Kenya, northern Kenya, has led to the creation of an organization called the Northern Ranges Trust, which is headquartered at the Lewa Wildlife Conservancy, which is another partner of ours. And since then, Northern Ranges Trust has now got under its umbrella 43 community-led conservancies, covering millions of hectares of northern Kenya community land, and providing really significant benefits to those communities who previously had never had any benefit from wildlife conservation or the wildlife that lived there.
Yeah. I'm more familiar with the South African context, and, a lot of people there growing up never even got to see wildlife, even though they may have lived, a few kilometers away. And so if you don't see it and you don't experience it and you're not benefiting from it, then why protect it? So it's so important to engage the communities and make them more a part of this whole world. So yeah, really, really amazing work. And going back to just the overall way you're looking at choosing organizations to work with. I don't know if this is a part of it, but I saw this on your website a lot. You talk about high efficiency. You guys are high efficiency. What's that mean? Just curious.
So I think because we as an organization, as I said earlier, we don't implement, we don't manage our own projects. We're not parachuting a team from the UK onto the ground to run these programs. It means that we're able to keep our core overhead, our staff overhead, and our teams to the minimum. And it allows us to be really efficient in delivering the funds to the ground where it's needed most. And, we've never allowed the organization to, if you like, grow fat. We're a very lean organization, and it's something again which I'm very proud of is how we are able to, on average, to deliver something like 92% of the funds we raise into the field.
Yeah, that's really amazing. There's a lot of organizations that do get bloated, and then it's, you're looking, and all the people that are kind of running in circles are getting paid tons of money, but nothing's really happening on the ground. So yeah, it's a really nice model. Can you go into maybe some of the solutions, you guys kind of list a few different areas you target, and this, maybe we can go into rangers a bit as well, but protecting endangered species is a big part of it, and funding some of these anti-poaching units. I don't know if you have an origin story of some of those first units that you funded, or how that became a priority.
Well, again, because of the history of when the organization was established, and poaching was a very serious issue. I mean, the illegal wildlife trade was completely out of control across the continent. And so I suppose that there was a natural focus for us to be trying to put support into, rangers, and that's always been the case. I mean, what's been exciting recently is how we've been able to establish what we call the Wildlife Ranger Challenge, which was a reaction to COVID, interesting enough, because when COVID struck, although the continent of Africa was not hit particularly hard by the pandemic itself, by the virus, of course, it was hit economically very, very hard and very, very swiftly. And because safari tourism, and tourism in particular, underwrites so much of how conservation is funded across Africa, both national parks and outside national parks, the lodges and the camps, people were losing their jobs, very, very quickly when the pandemic struck. And we very quickly saw how rangers were also being made redundant. And there was a real concern that we needed to do something about that. We were very fortunate. We had a philanthropist who approached us and said, I will put up a challenge grant of $5 million. This was back in 2020. If you can, but you need to unlock it dollar for dollar. And we went out to the ranger community across Africa, explained that we had this pot of money that, and we created this challenge. Basically, it's centered around getting ranger teams to run a half marathon with 22 kgs on their back. Quite a tough thing. But the rangers really responded to it. They loved it. They loved the idea of this. And in that first year, we raised $10 million, including the match. And it had a huge impact on the ranger community across Africa. We ended up, I think, underwriting something like 9,500 rangers and keeping them working on the front line, paying their salaries and looking after them in various ways and supporting their livelihoods. So that was a huge success. And then we We continued that last year, and we've just started again this year. In fact, this morning I've just been in a long session agreeing the distribution of something like another $3 million to the Ranger community. So that's been really hugely rewarding, and that over the last 3 years we've been able to effectively raise and commit something like $16 million to support Rangers and ensure that they were kept on the front line regardless of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's extremely impressive. And I remember I was actually in South Africa for 9 months during COVID. So we were working closely with the Timavati, and I remember, so many of these private reserves, all kinds of different places in the conservation space were just, instantly their funding was cut off when the tourism stopped. And everyone was kind of scrambling to figure out how we can keep as many people on as we could. And, if we lose all the rangers, what's the poaching going to look like? And there was a lot of panic in that moment.
There really was.
It's kind of impressive how quickly you guys were able to pull this together, because I know South Africa shut down their borders March 16th. That was the day I got there. So it sticks in my mind. When was the first race? Do you remember the first challenge? Was it in June or July?
So the first race was it was September 2020.
Yeah, but how did you come together so fast and build up the awareness too? Because you got so many people involved around the world pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, it was great. I think that everyone being in lockdown was sort of it was quite easy to get hold of people in a way. So it really captured people's imagination. There were two things I think that helped us with launching that initiative. Firstly, through the Tusk Conservation Awards, we had already instigated and run for a number of years the Tusk Wildlife Ranger Award, something that actually was the idea of Prince William himself, something he was very keen to do. And so we'd already sort of engaged, if you like, the Ranger community through the awards program. And then the other thing was that for the last 22 years now, one of our big fundraising events that we do every year is organize a marathon and half marathon that is held at the Lewa Wildlife Conservancy in Kenya. And it has become a hugely popular event that attracts runners from all over the world. So we knew how to basically set up and arrange a marathon event or a half marathon event. And so it was partly on the back of that the idea of the Wildlife Ranger Challenge came about. And we felt that, listen, to be a successful ranger, you've got to be fit. And therefore, let's try and create something which could play to their fitness, but also would engender goodwill and encourage a sort of camaraderie across the ranger sector. And it's certainly done that.
Yeah, and it's definitely a way to create some fun competition too, especially during COVID. It was, people were desperate to have some way to interact in a community way and get outside. And I was actually at the Southern African Wildlife College when their team went out, and I didn't have the weight on my back, but I ran with those guys and shot some video for them. And then most recently at the African Ranger Congress, I was out there with Andrew, and I think they had like the all-star team out there there were a couple Kenyans and a couple other guys. And it's just such a fun event, and everyone's checking online to see who's coming in where, and so I feel like the social media just explodes around this event. Yeah,
no, the social media was great, but also there was a private WhatsApp group for all of the ranger teams, and the whole of that day, that WhatsApp just is. It's fantastic to see. And I think one of the things, particularly on the back of COVID, but even without COVID, I think we have to remember that many of these rangers are working in some very remote places, in pretty harsh environments, going out for days on end on patrols with little rations, and it's dangerous. They're putting their lives on the line every day, and it's easy for them to forget that actually they are part of a very significant, probably, I don't know exact numbers, but it's between 50 and 60,000 rangers, employed across Africa. And through the Wildlife Ranger Challenge, we had over 2,000 rangers competing on the same day in that challenge. And, they just suddenly became aware that they were part of something much bigger. And there was this camaraderie and this respect for rangers, and they weren't alone.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I've, talking to a lot of different rangers, I've heard similar things where sometimes, they just feel like they're out there kind of on their own by themselves. And if it is a really challenging time, sometimes they start wondering, does anyone care what we're doing? Is anyone seeing this? So to create different ways for them to be a part of the bigger community, and even like the African Ranger Congress, just seeing rangers from all over Africa coming together, that camaraderie and that recognition that we're all in this together really builds morale and creates a better way to live and work. So yeah, special. Do you have any memories of rangers? I feel like, you've been all over Africa. You probably have a lot of experiences, but is there anything that stands out to you about rangers and the work they're doing just on a personal level?
I'm always struck by, how humble these people are and how incredibly dedicated they are. Actually through the Tusk Wildlife Ranger Award, some of the stories that we hear, from the nominations that we receive are really, truly moving. I'm not sure I can think of any specific one that I would highlight, but, I just think that as a community, they really deserve our respect. And, most of them are working on a wage that none of us could exist on. And many of them, too many of them, are injured or killed, in action, leaving their families destitute, often without any form of life insurance in place or any benefit systems. It's one of the things which we're very keen to see whether how we can help address that. Again, through the Wildlife Ranger Challenge is one of the vehicles that might be able to do something in that respect. But they are remarkable people. And the other thing is to, I think that something we've really wanted to try and portray in this recent Tusk Wildlife Ranger Award year was the fact that rangers aren't necessarily all men with guns.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot. In fact, the vast majority of rangers out there are probably unarmed, and they're rangers, they are teachers, they are researchers, they're guides. They play a whole host of different functions within the conservation world, and they are the front line of defense, for our natural world. They are, if you like, the key workers of the natural world. They deserve our full respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know for me personally, that's what really brought me into this world, is just meeting some of these men and women. You instantly just gain so much respect for them and the way they hold themselves and the passion they have for the work they're doing. And like you said, the conditions a lot of them are in, but still just feel like, this is a calling for them, and they're doing not work for just themselves and their communities, but they realize that it's for the whole world, what they're protecting. And yeah, they're just such a diverse group doing so many different jobs. And even going back to the communities, I feel like a lot of times rangers are the best connection to the local community and advocates for both sides. So it's just so important to support them and give them our respect and do all we can. So yeah, I really appreciate all the work you've done around the rangers.
Well, thank you. Well, we'll continue to do so without a doubt.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about ambassadors and how those play a role in what you're doing? And of course, Prince William, the royal patron, how he got involved. And what's the power of having these ambassadors to kind of raise awareness and help fund these projects?
Yeah, we're very fortunate. Tusk has got, I'd like to say, the ultimate ambassador in Prince William, who I think people recognize has a true passion, genuine interest, and a deep knowledge of Africa and conservation issues. So he's not just there as a figurehead. He is someone who's proactively involved in conservation, always wants to learn more, and recognizes that he's in a fortunate position to have a convening power that can work to our advantage and to the advantage of all the charities that he supports, with whether it's conservation or mental health or whatever the issues that he's supporting. So we're very, very lucky in having him as our patron, and we were lucky that he himself spent part of his gap year in Africa, and coincidentally happened to be at a project which was supported by Tusk, and that's how he became aware of the organization, and that's what led to him very fortunately choosing us as one of his first two charities to support. But before him, and when I first set up the charity, actually the very first celebrity ambassador that I got on board may surprise some people, was Ronnie Wood from the Rolling Stones. And Ronnie loves Africa and passionate about conservation of the environment. And I happened to know him through my previous business. And in those early years, he was incredibly valuable in helping to start to get the Tusk name sort of out there and to draw the interest of the media, because in those days nobody knew Tusk. They certainly didn't know who I was. I had no credibility. So having well-known personalities who are willing to put their head above the parapet and act as an ambassador, was essential. And over the years, we managed to attract a number of quite well-known individuals, particularly here in the UK, who were willing to support us. And we also made a few documentaries on our projects, quite often with a celebrity acting as the narrator or who were presenting the documentary. And so sometimes a broadcaster would come to us and say, we'd like to do this, we're interested in doing a film on this project, and then they would sometimes bring the celebrity, if you like, to the project. And that then, once we had the celebrity on the ground seeing the work we were doing, more often than not, they became, fantastic ambassadors and advocates for what we were doing. So over the years, we've been lucky, and people like Bear Grylls, for instance, Bear is fantastic, very proactive, particularly supportive in the terms of the ranger community, unsurprisingly. But no, we've got a number of supporters, and we really appreciate their help.
Yeah, and it's just so great to see celebrities using their influence to help organizations like yours do good in the world, because there's so much noise out there. Sometimes it takes a name to help elevate out of that that sea of media mess. But how about dive into a couple of these other projects? We've worked a lot with the Southern African Wildlife College. They're a big part of our film, especially the ranger side of things. Can you talk at all about that relationship and how it formed and what you guys are supporting there?
Yeah, so the Southern African Wildlife College is a really impressive institution based on the edge of the Kruger National Park. And, as its name would suggest, it is a college, but it's devised a number of really impressive educational courses, not only to train rangers, but people wanting to get into different areas of wildlife management and conservation. And it attracts people from all over the world. But for a number of years, what we've done has been to fund and sponsor rangers from different parts of Africa to go to the Southern African Wildlife College. Really, it's the best probably of the continent. And, to attend these courses and really sort of upskill themselves so that they can then return to their teams and just improve the way in which they operate as rangers. And actually one story very early on, this must have been late 90s, possibly early 2000s, the Labour Wildlife Conservancy asked us whether we would sponsor I think it was 4 of their team to go down and attend the college, which they did. And one of those guys, a guy called John Pomeri, came back. It absolutely, it sort of set him off on a path that has seen him climb through the organization. And he's gone back to the college for sort of higher level courses. He's now learned to fly, and he's moved up through the ranks, and he's now head of wildlife, basically, in Lewa. And it's just so gratifying to see a ranger who's come from absolutely nowhere now in this position of considerable responsibility, having the skills drummed into him and the confidence built, and he's ended up now at the top of the tree. And that's a sort of, I think, is a very good example of how the Southern African Wildlife College can really make a huge difference to men and women who go there. So it's we've got a long-standing partnership with them. We've also supported their canine team as well. And actually, the other interesting thing is that through the portfolio of projects that Tusk supports, I think I mentioned we've got about 45 partners on the ground, is every other year we have a symposium where we bring all of our partners together for 4 days. And it is a sort of melting pot for ideas and solutions and challenges to be discussed. What we've often found, across the continent is that people have often got the same problem. And then you'll find that one area has worked out a really clever solution to that problem. But another area has got exactly the same problem, hasn't worked it out. And it's only through collaboration and this exchange of ideas that we're able to encourage that. And interesting enough, the Southern African Wildlife College have instigated a collaboration with another one of our partners from Botswana called Coaching for Conservation, which is another environmental education program in Botswana. And the two of them met each other at one of the Tusk symposiums, and they just immediately hit it off, and this sparked this idea for its collaboration. And that's something that we're very, very keen to encourage. And in fact, as a result of the most recent symposium we had in February, I think we've seen the instigation of something like 19 different collaborations between partners. And we've just launched an appeal, actually, to raise a fund of money to underwrite a collaboration fund so that we can take those ideas and we can seed them so that those ideas can take root. Because I think one of the things that we've seen over the years is how there's a desperate need for greater collaboration across the conservation sector. So that's something which we're very proud of and very keen to continue to promote.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, yeah, like you said, collaboration is so needed right now. And to get people in a room like that and have an event where they can make those connections and those ideas start going back and forth, because I feel like oftentimes people get in their own little silos in the conservation world, and someone, like you said, might have a solution on the other side of the country that could really benefit what they're doing. And unless they hear from each other and get in a room together, it's pretty rare that collaboration happens. So really, really great work there. And yeah, the Southern African Wildlife College too. I've managed to go witness a couple of selections and follow some men and women going through course, and just to see that growth and transformation of those students is so inspiring too, because, a lot of times these young men and women don't have that many opportunities, sadly, in their communities, and haven't really had a chance to test themselves. And when you see them get tested, and sometimes might be like, I don't know if I can do this, but then they make that breakthrough, and all of a sudden they just completely shift. And it's a beautiful thing to witness. And even talking about, Anton, who's the main hero in our film, he was trained at the Wildlife College, and same thing as the other men you mentioned. He kind of worked his way up over the years and went from basically doing construction at the Timbavati to becoming a ranger to leading the entire team through, that education and support that he got. Just became an amazing leader in his space. So yeah, they're doing just excellent work there, and so many great people involved. So really, really amazing program to support. Maybe we could shift a little bit to Big Life, which I don't have as much experience with, but I got to visit earlier, a couple of months ago. It was my first time up in Kenya, which is an amazing country. And that Amboseli area where you have, Mount Kilimanjaro on the horizon, is just such a beautiful place. Got to spend some time with Richard Bonham, got to see the Ranger project there and meet a lot of the Rangers, and just so many amazing things going on, such a big, beautiful space as well. So maybe you could talk about your guys' involvement with Big Life and what efforts you're supporting there.
Yeah, so Tusk has been sponsoring and funding Big Life for many, many years. In fact, since it started, under a previous guise, it was known as the Maasai Land Preservation Trust, started by Richard Bonham. It's an incredible landscape, as you say, dominated by the mountain, Mount Kilimanjaro, and the Amboseli ecosystem, where, of course, there's this remarkable population of elephant, beautiful and some really big tusker elephant in Amboseli, but surrounded by basically Maasai community group ranches. And these are, sure everyone knows that the Maasai are pastoralist people, and so they graze their cattle over this land and have coexisted with wildlife for millennia, basically. But the difficulty, has been around the temptation of poaching from the illegal wildlife trade, and also because of, the Maasai culture was to, when you become a man, culture sort of used to dictate, not so much now, thank God, but used to dictate that you go and kill a lion. And the lion population was decimated in this part of Kenya. But through Big Life, Richard has built up I think it's now got something like 130 rangers, a team of 130 rangers dotted across this whole landscape, right away through to the Tanzanian border and Tsavo, the Tsavo ecosystem. He's covering a huge area. I can't remember the figures offhand, but with a very small remnant wild population of black rhino too, by the way, that live in the lava flows of the Chulu Hills, which in themselves are very beautiful as well. So he has, through this initiative, recruited and trained community from the Maasai community, these game scouts. They've become incredibly effective. And then the other thing on the, related to the lion, what Richard has done has been extraordinary. Is he's persuaded the Maasai to basically, by and large, stop killing predators, and therefore, in a way, accept the threat that those predators represent on their livestock. And he's introduced a predator compensation scheme, whereby, if you lose a cow or a goat or sheep to a lion or a leopard or a cheetah or a hyena, there is a compensation scheme that kicks in. It's very cleverly created, so it can't be abused. But what it has done over the last probably 10 years or more now has allowed the predator community, population, and particularly lion population, to really reestablish itself and to come back and to be accepted. Okay, there are still going to be the odd disgruntled herdsman who loses something, cattle, but there is this compensation scheme that kicks in, and it's just been remarkable how he has helped to restore that habitat and ecosystem, protect its elephant from the worst ravages of poaching. It's an incredible success story.
Yeah, so many great things going on there. And I think I'm pretty new to it. So when I was there, I learned a little bit about, I think they call it the Maasai Olympics. One of the ways to, overcome this, cultural need to kill a lion as you come into manhood, but creating something that's, has a similar effect without, death to wildlife. So pretty special event that's been created there. And the community seemed really supportive of it. So that was really cool. I don't know if you know any more. I see you shaking your head.
Yes, I do. Absolutely. I've never actually been to the Maasai Olympics, but I've seen the film and pictures of it, and it's clearly that it's captured the imagination of the Maasai community. So now, instead of trying to impress your girlfriend by killing a lion, if you win gold medal in whichever discipline it is during the Maasai Olympics, that seems to have the same effect.
Yeah, so great. And I actually had a little bit of time to go walk with the Rangers over in that black rhino area, and there's definitely a lot of sign, and they were excited about how well they were doing. So Yeah, just an epic place, and such a different place than South Africa too. Just not having any fences and just seeing the wildlife roam and the Maasai herding their cattle through there. It was a beautiful experience.
It's a huge. That's I think one of the big differences between South Africa and East Africa is these extraordinary open landscapes that go on for miles and miles and miles without a fence in sight, and it's as it has been for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah. Are there any other projects you'd like to highlight as we're getting near the end, that maybe something that's one of the newer projects or anything else that really stands out?
Yes, goodness, it's very difficult. We've got programs in Namibia, for instance. Namibia, for anybody who's not been there, is so different to the rest of Africa. Particularly the northern part of the country, it's like landing on Mars. And it's extraordinary that any wildlife lives in this sort of desert landscape. And you've got these desert adapted rhino and desert elephant and desert lion and giraffe. It's an extraordinary place, and again has been at the forefront of very successful community-based tourism. And it's something that we've been, very much actively investing in and sponsoring for a number of years. And it's a part of the world which I really, really enjoy going to visit. Perhaps, mentioning some of the marine programs that we support. There's an extraordinary coastline that Africa, the African continent, has. And, like so many other places in the world, is suffering. The coral reefs are suffering, and there's overexploitation of fishing, not normally by the community themselves, but because you've got these big Chinese factory trawler, fishing fleets that come in and just sweep up everything indiscriminately. So, we've got a number of projects which are supporting turtle conservation, particularly up in Lamu in northern Kenya. Very successful turtle conservation scheme there, protecting the nesting beaches, but also, again, working with the fishermen so that if they happen to catch a turtle in their nets, they can bring it in, and the project will then do a release program. They'll get, and they can give, they will be rewarded, for doing so, rather than doing away with that turtle. And then then look to sort of Central Africa and around the Virunga Mountains and Bwindi of the impenetrable forest of Uganda. You've got the mountain gorilla population, which has actually been one of the sort of conservation success stories. The mountain gorilla population has been steadily recovering. It's still perilously low, but it is steadily recovering as a result of huge conservation efforts in that area. And we've got a remarkable project that we support there called Conservation Through Public Health. And one of the things, of course, that the pandemic has highlighted has been, this threat to human population through zoonotic disease. Effectively, COVID is zoonotic. And so by the same virtue, the mountain gorilla population, because their DNA is so closely related to the human DNA, is that they are very susceptible to human diseases. And so one of the projects we're supporting there is to really try and minimize the transmission of human diseases amongst the mountain gorilla population. That's been a great success, and we've got a program there that we're supporting, which is working with the coffee farmers who are growing coffee right up to the boundary of the park, where the gorillas, sometimes the gorillas will come out into the coffee plantations. So there, Gladys Kalema, who runs this project, has been very successful in establishing gorilla coffee. And she markets this all around the world, and is able, on the back of that sort of messaging, to get a premium for the coffee for those farmers. And so again, they derive this benefit. They see the link between protecting the gorillas and preserving their habitat, because it brings them a higher revenue for their coffee. So I could go on for hours about that.
Yeah, so many wonderful projects you're all supporting, and just so much amazing work. I don't know, do you have any advice for someone that's maybe just coming into the conservation space, trying to find ways to get involved, maybe thinking about starting their own project. What kind of advice do you have for young men and women?
I mean, I can only really speak about sort of African conservation, but you wouldn't be surprised. We get inundated with requests from young people, students, saying, can they come and work for us, or can they come and work on one of our projects? And we're just not structured in that way, unfortunately, to do that. But what I would say is that if anyone is able, and obviously this is, you could be quite fortunate to be in this position, but if you're able to get out to Africa on your own dollar, if you like, and to travel around a little bit and meet people on the ground, that is by far the best way of potentially getting an entree into helping a project or getting a job on the ground, because it then is not a blind date. If and I've seen lots of people, manage to somehow find their way into helping a project on the ground. You've got to be willing to do anything, and sort of manage your expectations. Conservation is not always as glamorous as people might think. It can be pretty tough. You've been living in very remote conditions and poor conditions, but it is very rewarding. But I think that we've always taken the position that, for us, that if our projects have got if they're looking for people, we're always trying to encourage them to recruit locally amongst the indigenous community, because it's so important that we have more people, more Africans working in conservation and working their way up the tree. We spoke earlier about how the value and the importance of communities seeing the benefits of conservation and protecting, the environment in which they're living. But what's also incredibly important is, and I think to recognize, and this goes for the world over, by the way, is that the human population is increasingly urbanized. I think I saw a stat the other day that something like 50% of the world's population is now urbanized. And that inevitably means that the human species, or 50% of the human species, is becoming more and more disconnected with the natural world. And so I think one of the challenges that we are facing is, how do we ensure that we as humans, government leaders, business people, continue to place the environment, the natural world, higher enough up the agenda, and recognize that ultimately, if we continue to destroy the natural world as we've been doing, and the rate that we've been doing, then ultimately that's going to see the demise of all humanity. It doesn't matter how clever we are, we still rely on the natural world. Every breath of air that we breathe and every mouthful of food we eat relies on the natural world. And we need these areas of functioning ecosystems with wildlife, to help combat climate change and to maintain the natural world. So as a species, unfortunately, we're too arrogant sometimes to see what we are doing. I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah, beautifully put. And maybe to wrap things up, Charlie, if you could, why do you keep doing this work? I mean, there are a lot of challenges. Sometimes it can feel hopeless. It's pretty daunting, but what keeps you going? What do you wake up and get excited about?
If one sat and just studied the statistics of how many species we've lost, what is it? 60% of all species has been lost in the last 50 years. I mean, that's a shocking indictment of the human race. If you just sat and look at those stats, the answer is pretty depressing. But I see so many positive things, and I see the impact of the investments that Tusk is making in the project partners that we're supporting. I come back always just re-energized, from any trip to Africa, and it gives me hope. Africa still has very significant tracts of wild habitat. It's going, but it does still have them, unlike the rest of the world. And so we've got to do everything in our power to halt that decline and ensure that we don't lose it all. And so I've always been an optimist, and I think to work in conservation, you have to be.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Charlie. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to chat with us and tell us about your story and all the amazing work you're doing at Tusk. Really appreciate it.
Not at all. It's been an absolute pleasure, John. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Rhino Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Rhino Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who have dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the Movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.